thank each and every person who joins in with us on this Thursday podcast. Tamika, thank you so much for joining in with us on tonight. Latanya Rainey, thank you so much for joining in with us on tonight. If you all would be so nice and so kind, good evening, good evening, good evening. If you all would be so nice and kind to go ahead and share the video, like, love, tag a few people in so that Facebook can indicate to others that I am on tonight. Hopefully, tonight is the messages will be a blessing, as we know anytime we get the word of God. That is a blessing. Charlene Rainey, thank you so much for joining in with us on tonight. I see my sister Tasha on here. Hey Tasha, how you doing? Y'all, like I said, go ahead and share the video out. Paris, thank you so much for joining in with us on this Thursday night podcast. It's truly a blessing to see you on tonight. Y'all, I'm gonna go ahead and tag a few people in, and then I'll go ahead and get started. Thank you, each and every person. Markeisha Stewart, thank you so much for joining in with us on tonight. Y'all, I really hadn't prepared a lot for tonight, but I did know what I was going to talk about. I had been looking at um the the book of Acts, where Paul was on a ship and the ship was going to wreck. Um, well, not sure if you know about the story of Paul. Well, Paul was taken prisoner and he was put on a boat. But Paul's, I'm just gonna give you paraphrase. I'm just gonna give you a little bit breakdown the history of it. It's Acts 27. Paul was supposed to be going to Rome. He gets on a ship. Paul is taken prisoner on the ship, and Paul advises the captain that they should stay on the road of Crete. But because I'm assuming because Paul was a prisoner, the captain decided he was going to take his own way. Now there's a topic up there that says turning pain into purpose. Um, I was looking at this story and there was a question that I began to ask myself. What happens when the ship has to wreck? Because in this story, the ship it's gonna wreck. Paul tells them that this ship is gonna crash. But there was a question that I asked myself, and the question was, what happened when the ship has to wreck? Because the ship is gonna wreck. And as I began to look at the story, this story that where Paul he tried to warn them even before the ship wreck, that if they got off the what where they were selling to, if they kept selling along Creed, that that would be the best direction for them. But if they took another direction, then he didn't think that was going to turn out well. So as I begin to look and as I begin to ask myself the question, even in life, what happens when your life takes a turn and there's nothing you can do about it? What happens? So as I began to look at the story and I began to look at Paul on this boat, and Paul was telling them that if we continue in this direction, that the ship is gonna wreck. But because Paul was a prisoner, they felt like, to me, I guess they felt like they didn't have to listen to him because he was just a prisoner and he had been taken captive. So sometimes it comes to the point you ask yourself a question. What happens when the ship has to wreck? What happens when life takes a turn? What happens when life as you knew it turns around and it changes and it doesn't change for the good? What happens? So I asked myself the question, do you trust God even when the ship is about to wreck? Do you trust God even when you see that your life is taking a direction that you don't want to go in? What happens? Pierre, thank you so much for joining in. So the question that I had to ask myself was, what happens? What happens when the ship has to wreck? Because Paul warned them. He says, if we take the direction that you're taking, he says that this ship is gonna wreck. But one thing we find out in this story, Paul trusted God even in the midst of knowing that his life was about to change on this ship because it was going to wreck. So the question becomes the question that you can ask yourself, what happened? So as I began to look at the story, and I said, Gwen, thank you so much for joining in. In life, sometimes the way we plan things is not the way that they turn out to be. Y'all, hold on one second. Thank y'all so much. So, the way that we plan things is not the way that they turn out. So I began to look and I just began to look and I began to look at life and I began to look at circumstances and situations and how things happen in our life. And the question came to me is, what happens when this ship begins to wreck? What happens when life starts to happen? What happens when your life takes a change for the worse and not the better? What happens? What do we do at that point in time in life? I believe that's a serious question that, we can ask ourselves is what happens? And as I began to look and as I began to look and as I began to read this story, sometimes there's warning before destruction, but we all have a choice. As we talked about on Monday, you have a choice and you have a chance. So as I began to look and I began to look over life, and I said, sometimes, life will throw you curves that you never expected. Sometimes you will have balls thrown at you that you wasn't ready to catch. Sometimes there's going to be news that you're going to hear that you wasn't, that you had not braced yourself for. But the question comes down to, what do you do when your ship has to wreck? Because in this story, if you read the story of Paul told them, Paul was an apostle. Paul told them, he told them this ship is going to wreck. And why did the ship wreck? For one, the ship wrecked because they decided they was going to go the way they wanted to go. Because Paul had warned them, like, hey, we need to stay on this road, because if we stay on this road, this will be the best route for us. But if we deviate off of this road, then the ship is going to be in trouble. So as I began to look, and I began to look over life. And sometimes, y'all, life can get hard. Life can get hard. What happens when the plan, the purpose, and the destiny that God has for you? What happens when it takes a turn and it's not the turn that you were expecting? What do you do? That becomes the real question. Do you still trust God? Or do you take the direction that you want to take just because it doesn't seem like you're going to get to where God has promised you? Now, you remember, we always say delayed does not mean denied. Sometimes God has to delay something in order to perfect you, to get you to where Paradise, thank you so much for joining in order to perfect you, to get you to the point of being ready for where he's trying to take you to. Thank you, Kiki, for joining in. So I looked at this story and I began to look and I says, I looked at the story and I looked at the story just like life. What happens when life turns around and life doesn't go the way you expect it to? What happens? What happens? That's the big question I had to ask myself. Like, what do you do? Do you stop trusting God? Do you take the route that you want to take, or do you still follow the path that God has put you on? So now I'm looking at Paul and I'm looking at Paul on this ship, and Paul had advised these people because guess what? Paul had been shipwrecked more than one time. This wasn't Paul's first time being shipwrecked. So Paul had experience in being shipwrecked. That's why he knew how to tell them what direction that to go in. So what Paul does is he advises them. Relier, thank you so much for joining in. He advises them to not get off the path that they were headed to get to Rome. So what happens when the path takes a turn for the worse? Jeffrey, thank you so much for joining in. So as I began to look now, let's just look at real life situations. Sometimes in life, we have wrote the vision and we've made it plain, and we know the Bible tells us though it may tarry, it will still come to pass. So what happens when it looks like your vision is so close to being manifested? What happens when the shipwreck what happens? What happens? So we ask ourselves the question. So I find myself asking myself the question, do I throw in the towel or do I keep on going? Do I finish the race or do I stop the race? Do I keep going or do I just come to a halt? Because it seems like everything that's been working is now headed for destruction. So we know that, when God delays something, it does not mean denied. Thank you so much, Ross, for joining in. And as I began to look at this passage of Paul being on the ship, and Paul was warning these people. Now check it out. Paul was a prisoner, so he was captured by them. Paul did not have to give them any advice on the direction that they were going in. But one thing I realized about Paul was smart. Because I'm on this ship with you all, I'm going to tell you the best route to take, because guess what? The moves that you make in your life can affect the moves that I make in my life because I'm on this ship with you all. So one thing Paul did was Paul began to tell them that, listen, this ain't the first time I've been shipwrecked, and I understand how this go. I've been through trials and I've been through tribulations. And because I'm on this ship now, think about it. Paul is a passenger, but Paul is smart. He understands that if I don't tell you what's right, even though you all have me held captive, I still have to tell you what's right in a wrong situation. What do you do when you find yourself in a situation where you still got to do the right thing in a wrong situation? Because now Paul, he's a prisoner and they have him captive, and Paul is shackled and Paul is binded, but Paul still goes ahead and he tells them, listen, if we get off the path of going to Rome, if we get off the path, they was taking the path of Crete. If we get off of Crete and take any other direction, this mission is not going to turn out well. What happens when God says, I'm warning you that if you get off the path that I have you to go on, your ship is going to surely wreck? What happens? So we find ourselves in this question, and and I looked and I said, what does happen, God, when the ship is gonna wreck? And how does it feel to know that something is about to happen that's out of your control, that you have no control of? You find yourself asking God, what happens, God? How did I get here? Why did the ship go in the wrong direction? God, you said that you was taking me on the path path. Now it looks like my path is turning around. But what happens when it looks like everything is up against you, when it looks like hell and high water is rising up against you? Because on this ship, what they found is they found themselves going sinking deeper and deeper, because they said the water was getting so deep. What happens when you find yourself getting deep into stuff that you never seen coming? What happens? So as I began to look, and I began to look at this story, and I began to look at Paul, and I says, well, Paul had warned the people that if they got off the path to Rome, that there was gonna be a shipwreck. So Paul says, listen, because what you do on this ship is gonna affect my life, I'd rather tell you what's right before it happens than not try to tell you and we go in the wrong direction and we head for trouble. What happens? So as I begin to look, and as I begin to look, and I begin to think, and I'm looking in the world today, and a lot of things are happening that's out of our control, and we're asking God, how did we get here? And God, why did it happen? And how did I come to this point? God, you said write the vision and make it plain. So what happens when your ship looks like the way it was sailing, now it has taken a detour because there is a storm that's about to come? What happens? God, do I throw the anchor out there, or do I keep the anchor in the boat? Matter of fact, do I throw myself over in the water, or do I stay in the boat? What happens? Monique, thank you so much for joining in. So I find myself with a lot of questions as to what happened. What happens when everything that once was flowing in the right direction starts to flow backwards? What happens? So now I'm looking at this story, and I says Paul had warned the people that if they got off the path, that the ship was going to wreck, but Paul still did the right thing, even though Paul was in a wrong situation. Now they had took Paul captive as a prison. So he's a prisoner, but Paul understood that whatever move you make affects my life, and whatever move I make affects your life. So what I'm going to do is, because I know that if we take the wrong direction, this not going to end well for us, because I've seen this move before. So what happens? So as I began to look over life, and I began to think, and I says, what happens when you find yourself against a rock and a hard place? What happens when you're stuck between a rock and you stuck between a hard place? Do you stay there, or are you determined to come out? Because we find ourselves in this lifetime asking a lot of questions. God, what happens now? What am I going to do? Where do I go from here? Do I stay on the boat because I know that the boat has went in the wrong direction, and I know that if I stay on the boat, Paul has already warned me that the boat is gonna be shipwrecked? But one thing Paul did was, Paul says, listen, I understand that we so far out here now, and we went in the wrong direction. What happens when you go in the wrong direction in your life, and now there's pain in the situation, because now you see your life flashing before your face? What happens when God says you're going out into the deep end, but what I need you to do is come back to shallow waters? What happens when you keep swimming to the deep end of the pool, and then you find yourself bobbing up and down and gasping for air, because you didn't realize that God had you on the right path, but you decided that you would take yourself a little bit deeper and try to get into something deeper? What happens when the ship is gonna wreck? So Paul warns them. He says, listen, we so far out here now. It's nothing we can do. So now the men find themselves on the ship, and they're all in frustration and aggravation, because they're scared now. Because the path that they have taken, they're so far off a track that they're going in a direction where the direction they're going in is wintertime in the direction that they're going in. And normally you shouldn't be sailing in a boat in the wintertime, but they've taken themselves so far off course. What happens? So Paul looks at them and he says, listen, he says, He says, I understand we've gotten a little bit off course. So Paul tells him, he says, he says, none of this would be going on right now if you would have listened to the instructions that I had given you. So Paul was telling them, Paul told them, he says, I told you that if you didn't turn around, you're going too far into a situation. If you don't turn around, this situation is not going to end well. So Paul tells them, he says, listen, all this trouble that we're facing right now is because of a choice and a decision that you all decided to make. If you would have listened to me, we never would have ran into this storm. But see, God is so good. Sometimes you have to run into a storm in order to know that it's not your way, it's God's way, because you asking God, God, what do I do now? What happens when the ship has to wreck? Taz, thank you so much for joining in. And why do I keep saying that the ship has to wreck? Because according to this story, they got so far, it wasn't no turning back around. Paul told them, listen, the ship is going to wreck. That's a known fact. Paul says, I've been there before. I've been down this road before. I traveled this path. And the reason I'm warning you that the ship is going to wreck, if you don't turn around sometime soon and get back on the right path, I'm warning you that it's not going to end good in this shipwreck. So now you got the sailors on the boat, and now they're throwing things. They're throwing ropes at the boat, and they're throwing the cargo out because now they're trying to save themselves. And what they do is they start to throw the cargo overboard. And so after a long time without food, so now they're scared to the point, because sometimes you got to trust God even when you can't trace God. Now, guess what? They couldn't trace God in this storm, but they still needed to trust God. But instead of trusting God, they started operating in fear. What happens when the storm of your life hits you? What do? Do you start to operate in fear, or do you keep your faith? That's the question, y'all. We could be real on here tonight. Because sometimes I find myself, I have to be real with myself, and I have to say, what do you do when situations and circumstances come up where it looks like your back is pinned against the wall and it's not going to get off the wall? What do you do? Do you keep your faith, or do you start to operate in fear? Do you keep the faith the size of a mustard seed, knowing that the faith the size of the mustard seed can move you off the wall and move you on solid ground? What do you do when you find yourself stressed and pressed and aggravated and frustrated because it looks like the vision that you got, that you were so close to seeing the manifestation, it just comes to a halt? What do you do when it looks like God has brought you out of the prison and put you in the palace, but you find yourself easing closer back to the prison because you've moved out of safety grounds of the palace? What do you do? Do you operate in fear, or do you operate in faith? What do you do? Do you trust God? Because see, these people had got to the point on this boat where Paul says, listen, I'm telling you, if we don't turn around, it's not going to end well for us. He says this ship is going to wreck. So what do you do when you find out the ship is going to wreck? That's a question that you have to ask yourself. Because the ship is going to wreck don't mean that you're going to die. Sometimes we so in fear of losing our life because we see that the ship is coming to a wreck. But Paul says, listen, we out here now. We might as well make a decision. What we gonna do? So Paul tells them, he says, after they had gone a long time without food, stress will make you stop eating, y'all. Stress, frustration, aggravation, when life takes a turn, be careful what you do in the midst of a storm, because sometimes that can determine the end results of what is going to happen, because we make quick decisions without consulting God. So Paul says, he says to the men, he says, you should have took my advice not to sail from Crete. So he's telling them, I told you if we sail from Crete, it wasn't going to end good. He says, then you would have spared yourself this damage and loss. Now he tell them, he said, You could have saved yourself if you just would have took the direction that God was taking you on. Delay does not mean denied. You want to take a quick way, but God is saying don't take that way because that way is not the right way. What do you do when you find yourself in life and you don't know if you're coming or going? What do you do when you find yourself in life when you feel like your finances are getting low, but your bills and your problems are getting above your head? What do you do when you find yourself in situations that's uncomfortable? What do you do when you find yourself in these storms? Do you keep your faith or do you operate in fear? Because I'm gonna tell y'all, let's just be real on tonight. We can say we got all this faith, but let the right situation and circumstance come in your life, and then we'll see which direction you operate in. Will you operate in the fear, and will you operate in faith? Because when these men got on this boat, they had all the faith in the world because they were supposed to be going to Rome. They had all this great faith getting on this boat. They even took the prisoners on the boat with them. They had all this great faith because they just knew that the ship was going to keep sailing and that the ship was going to sail without any flaws and disappointments and any heartaches and any heartbreaks. They were okay until they found out I'm off the path that I should have been on, and now I'm headed for destruction. What happens when you find yourself in life and life throws you a turn that you never expected and you never seen coming? Life shifts, and then you have to shift with life. What happens? That's a real life question. Now it says to the point where these people were depressed and they were stressed. They throwing stuff overboard. They throwing their cargo over. They throwing the anchors over. They don't know what to do. Be careful when life throws you a curve, because you'll find yourself if you deviate too far from God's path, you'll find yourself in a position that you're asking God, what do I do now? So as I begin to look at this story and I begin to look at life and I begin to talk to God and I begin to say, God, you got to help your people as well as help your people. I'm just going to be real. You got to say, God, help me, because I found myself on a path that it looked like I was going in the direction, and God, I ran into a roadblock. What happens when you driving down the street and you come to a dead end? What happens? What happens? So what they did is they find themselves, now they frustrated and they aggravated. But Paul says, listen, he says, if you would have listened to me, then we wouldn't be in this position. But let me tell you something about Paul. Not that Paul is throwing anything in their face, because he's not. Because remember what I said, whatever they do from this point out, whether Paul told them to go that way or go this way, it affects Paul's life. And whatever Paul does from this point on out, it affects their life. So Paul says, listen, I see that we in trouble. And I see that we done got too far out here. And I see that this is a brutal storm. See, this wasn't like the storm when Jesus told the disciples to let's go to the other side. This was a brutal storm. And check it out. Jesus wasn't on the boat with them this time. At least the disciples had a savior on the boat with them at the time when they were to go to the other side. Paul was the only savior that was going to be on this boat for them. So guess what happens? You really got to start operating in faith. Because I understand that life is going to give you twists and life going to give you turns, and life is going to take you from ups to down, and life is going to give you highs and lows, and life is going to give you where you take 2 steps forwards and you feel like you sliding 2 steps backwards. But I'm trusting God that if you brought me to it, you'll bring me through it. So what Paul began to do, he says, listen, I understand that now you all are aggravated and frustrated, but but I also understand that the next moves that we make, it determines if everybody lose their life on this ship. So Paul says, even though you got me held captive, I'm still going to do right in the wrong situation. See, Paul said, this ain't the time to get spiteful because you need me and I need you. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to advise y'all, don't lose your faith right now. It's not the time. Thank you, J. Lou, for joining in. So Paul says to them, he tells them, you've gone a long time without eating. So Paul tells them, you need to eat. So then he tells them, he says, we could have spared ourselves this damage if we would have took the right directions. He says, but now I urge you to keep your courage. Paul says, listen, right now, only thing we can do is operate in faith. I understand that, Mickey, thank you so much for joining in. Paul says all we can do now is operate in faith. We on this ship. We in a brutal storm. We don't have Jesus at the bottom of the boat that we can go call Jesus and say, do you care if we perish? Paul says, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to encourage you all on tonight to keep your faith. He says, I'm going to encourage you to keep your courage that you have right now. He says, and I'm telling you, I'm not going to tell you no lie. Life is about to throw us a curve. And this ship is going to come to a wreck. So I'm not going to tell you that we're going to sail and it's going to be a smooth sailing. He says, but what I'm going to tell you is this. He says, I'm going to keep trusting God in the midst of adversity. So I asked myself the question, what do you do when adversity hits your life? Do you trust God or do you throw the towel in? What happens when everything that was going good takes a turn and starts to go bad? What happened? We have to be real and ask ourselves what happens now? What happens next? Because talking to people, this life that we're living in, God says, I come to give life and life more abundantly, but through the things that we're seeing, it starts to squeeze you. It starts to press you. It starts to stretch you. But what do? Do you keep your faith or do you start to operate in fear? Because God says, for I know the thoughts that I think towards you, thoughts of good and not of evil. He says, I haven't given you the spirit of fear, but love, peace, and a sound mind. So God says, I haven't given you the spirit of fear. If you operate in fear, you're not operating in me. But if you keep your faith the size of a mustard seed, see what God is saying is faith is the substance of things hoped for, evidence of things not seen. How can you survive and the ship is about to be wrecked? So I'm asking myself the question, and sometimes you just got to put yourself on the boat and you just got to be like Paul and you got to say, how can the ship survive when the ship is going to be wrecked? Ask yourself, it's life. How can I survive this moment in my life when my back is up against the wall? How can I survive when the ship is going to be wrecked? Paul says, I need you to keep your courage. Sometimes in life, we don't realize that if it wasn't for us keeping our faith in God and the courage that we had in God and God giving us grace and mercy, how will we survive the shipwreck? Some of us have found ourselves when the car should have crashed, God granted mercy and grace and the car didn't crash. How do I keep my faith when I see that my ship is about to wreck? Thank God that God puts people in your life that can tell you the ship is gonna wreck, but you'll come out on the other side. So what Paul does is he says, listen, he says, I know the ship is gonna wreck. He said, I hate to tell you this. He said, I don't have no good news. He said, I have bad news, but then I have good news. So I can imagine Paul saying, what news do you want first? The ship is going to crash. That's a known fact. We can't avoid that. But do you want to hear what the God I serve can do even in the midst of a ship that's going to crash? What do we do? Paul says, listen, he says last night, an angel of the God whom I belong to. See, Paul says, I got to make it personal now. He says, because I tried it y'all way. And when I told y'all if we go this way, we was going in the right direction. See, Paul says, I tried it y'all way. He says, but now I got to do what I know best. Paul says, listen, I don't know who y'all belong to, but I know who I belong to. So Paul says, listen, he says last night, he says an angel of God whom I belong to and whom I serve stood before me. So Paul says, let me really tell you who I am right now. Paul says, I can't afford to operate in faith at this moment, but I understand that I'm in a ship that's going to crash. But Paul says, what I need to do is I need to remember that faith is the substance of things hoped for, evidence of things not seen. I ain't seen the ship crash yet, but I know it's going to crash. So Paul says, listen, now I got to make it personal because this is about me and God. Paul said, y'all looked at me as a prisoner, and because y'all looked at me as a prisoner, I wasn't worthy to tell you which direction to go in. Be careful when people look at you like you can't tell them what direction they to go in, because that's what they did. They dismissed what Paul had told them. Paul says, but right now I got to make it personal and I got to do only what I know how to do. So what Paul says is, he says, listen, the God I serve last night sent me some help. He says, and you know what, Paul, and I imagine not trying to be cocky or bold, you better tell some people because I'm on the ship with you. He not only sent me help, he sent you some help. See, sometimes people when they don't understand your calling from God, they get offended by your calling, and all you trying to do is say that the ship is gonna crash, but I'm here to tell you, you're not gonna be harmed. So Paul says, listen, he says last night, an angel of the God I serve. So now Paul says, listen, I don't know who y'all serve, but I know who I serve. He says, the God whom I belong to and whom I serve stood beside me. So God will send you some help when your ship crashed. Paul said the angel stood beside me because the God I serve sent me some help. Not only did he send me some help, he sent me a word. Not only did he send me a word, he sent me a word for you and me. He says, see, I realize I'm a prisoner, but I understand even being a prisoner that God is still faithful and active in my life. See, Paul said, y'all looking at me because I got these shackle and chains on right now. He says, and you looking at me like you bigger than me, but right now you need me and I need you. So as I begin to look at this story, Paul says, do not be afraid. So Paul starts to encourage them. Paul says, listen, I know y'all operating in fear right now, but my God told me to tell y'all not to be afraid. So what Paul says is, I'm going to encourage y'all, even though we gonna crash in this ship. He says, you must understand trial. You must stand trial before Caesar, and God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you. So Paul says, listen, God has granted grace on me. I know I'm coming to stand trial, but God is granting me grace. And because he's granted me grace, he's granted you grace. And so what he says is, he says, so keep your courage. He says, men, for I have faith in God that it will happen just as he told me. Paul says, listen, now ain't the time to faint. Now ain't the time to get scared, because the ship is going to crash. What happens when the ship starts to crash in life? What do? Do you hold on or do you let go? Do you stay on the boat and trust God, or do you throw yourself overboard? What happens when your finances seem low and the bills seem so high and it looks like everything that happens is burying you instead of lifting you up? What happens? We have to ask ourselves the question, what happens when we know that the ship is going to wreck? So Paul says, listen, he tells the men, he says, listen, he said, I want y'all to get yourself some courage. He says, for I have faith in God that it will happen just as he told me. He says, for one, God told me the ship gonna wreck. He said, yeah, I believe it. He said, but he also told me that I can live through a shipwreck. What Paul was saying is, there's going to be some stuff that come in your life that just wreck and flip your whole life upside down. But what Paul is saying, I encourage you to keep your faith in God, even when you know that the ship has wrecked in your life. When everything seems like it's tossed upside down and the winds are tossing you to and fro, Paul says, get you some courage and hold on to God's unchanging hand. Paul says, I understand that your life as you knew it has been put on hold and it has come to a halt. But Paul says, I'm here to encourage you right now that my God, the God I serve, the God that my help, my way maker, he has sent me some help and he has sent me a word. See, even though I'm in the same position you in, I'm going to give you a word to encourage you that God says that no weapon that formed against you will prosper. Yes, this ship is going to wreck. It's going to wreck and you're going to be on it. But God says, I promise you that you will live through the shipwreck. See, I begin to look at Paul, and Paul said I believe what God says. He tells him it's going to happen just the way he said it's going to happen. He said, nevertheless, we must run aground on some islands. So Paul is saying we got to go through this. We got to go through this shipwreck. He says, well, one thing I believe is that God told me that nobody that's on this boat with me is going to get harmed in the shipwreck. What happens? What happens when life flips upside down and changes and turnarounds in your life happen? Do we hold on to God's hand? That's the question that sometimes you have to ask yourself. What happens when I get out in the deep end of the ocean and I cannot swim? What happens? What happens in my life? So as I began to look at this story, and I began to look at Paul says, I understand that the ship is going to wreck in my life. And Paul says, but I understand the God that I serve has sent me help. How does God send us help? God says, I'll protect you. He says, I will never leave you or forsake you. Remember, God said that you may walk through the valley of the shadow of death, but let me tell you something. He says, you going through. If you going through something, that means you can't be stopped. See, I can go through a shipwreck and still crash and get off the boat and tell the story. See, sometimes life will give you experiences where you'll be able to tell the next person that I've been there where you're at. I've been in a shipwreck. I've lost some things and I've lost my way in life, but I promise you this. If you trust God's word, even when the ship is wrecking, I promise you God will sustain you even in the midst of adversity. Y'all, I begin to look and I begin to thank God, because sometimes I'm going to tell you in this lifetime, it gets rough and you have to encourage yourself through some situations and circumstances. And you have to just keep trusting God, just like Paul. Paul says, listen, you don't understand. See, y'all, let me tell you something. Sometimes we want to give up in life. We want to throw in a towel. But God says you are connected to somebody's blessing. So God is saying, I encourage you, don't throw in the towel because somebody needs you. Sometimes we think about giving up in life and just, I hear a lot of people, let's just keep it real. Mental illness is real. Suicide is real. God is saying you can't end your life because your life is connected to somebody else's life. And I need to use you as an example to pull them through their shipwreck. Sometimes in life, we find ourselves between a rock and a hard place, and we don't know if we coming or going. But God came on here and allowed me to tell you, just like Paul, yes, I understand you are in a shipwreck. Life has thrown you a curve that you never seen coming. But I encourage you to keep trusting God. Keep your faith in God. What do you do? What do you do is the question that we find ourselves asking ourselves. Do I stay or do I go? Do I move or do I stand still? Do I sink or do I swim? And we find ourselves asking ourselves the questions because for every action, there is a reaction. So I looked at the Apostle Paul, and Apostle Paul was a prisoner. Now check it out, a prisoner on this boat with these men. And he decided what you do from this point out will affect my life. God says, don't you dare throw in the towel, because you don't know how your connection is connecting somebody else to live. See, a lot of times we look at situations and circumstances and we don't know that our kids are looking for us to live in order for them to see an example of life and life more abundantly. How can you throw in the towel when God is saying, I have connected you to these people to bless these people? But if you throw in the towel, what happens? What happens? What happens? And y'all, as I begin to look, and I just thank God, I'm going to tell y'all, sometimes, baby, I'm going to tell you, people can look at people and say they're the strongest person in the world. But you only see what the person allows you to see. You really don't see the story behind the story behind the story. But God says, I come to make an example out of you to encourage people. Because God says they don't understand the story that's behind your story, that's behind another story. So what God is saying is, I understand that you have a story that's on top of a story. But God says, because I have so much grace and mercy on your life, that I'll only show them the strong side of you, because I need you to give me the weakest parts of your life. God says, when I called you as a strong man. And then I says, in your time of weakness, I'll be your strength. So God says, I won't even show them all the bumps and bruises, the hell, the high water, the tears that you cry late at night. God says, leave the weak side for me, but I need you to demonstrate to the strong side to my people. Y'all, I just thank God on tonight that he allows me, y'all, to come and give his word to each and every one of you out here tonight. Y'all, sometimes I'm gonna tell you, I don't feel like doing it. I just don't, because, I tell people say you so strong. But what I tell them is, you only see what I allow you to see. You only see what God will let me expose to you. But you don't see the pain behind the purpose, and the pain behind the destiny. You don't see behind the scenes, because God has allowed us to be strong before the people, but he says, I'll allow you to be weak behind the scenes. Y'all, I thank God. I thank God that we serve a God that says you can be vulnerable with me. I thank God that I serve a God that says you don't have to let them know the story behind the story, because I know the story. And in due time, when the story is to be told, I will allow you to give the story. What happens, y'all? What happens? What happens? What happens? What happens when we try to turn pain into purpose? What happens? What happens when we try to turn pain into purpose? What happens? What happens when we trying to make the story fit the vision? What happens, y'all? What happens? We have to sometimes ask ourselves the question, and I'm not scared. I'm not scared, and I don't have the fearful where I can be vulnerable with God, and I can ask God, what happens now? What's next? What's next? I wrote the vision and I made it plain, but it still seemed like my ship is going in the wrong direction and that my ship is about to crash. And God says, I can tell you what happened. Just like Paul, he says, listen, Paul, I'll send an angel to minister to you when you got tears in your eyes and don't know what you are to do. I'll send an angel to minister to you, just like Elijah. Remember, Elijah says, listen, he had just won the battle over Baal's men. And when Jezebel sent the word to Elijah that she was going to take his life, Elijah said, God, I'm tired of fighting. I'm tired of fighting. Just take my life. God says, I'll send an angel to minister to you when you get to the weakest point in your life. God says, listen, I say I'll be your strength when you are weak. God says, I'll allow you to walk through some valleys that seem really dark and nobody will understand that you even walking in the valley, because I'm constantly bringing you through. God is saying, listen, I need you to turn your pain into a purpose. I need you to turn your tears into joy. I need you to show the people that even in the midst of a shipwreck, God is still with me. Now I'm gonna tell you this. That don't mean that you're not gonna cry. Because the Bible says there's a time for everything. So the Bible says there's a time to laugh, there's a time to cry. It's a time to build and a time to tear down. The Bible says it's a time for everything. But the Bible also says weeping may endure for a night, but joy is coming in the morning. God says you may weep all night and turn around, and I'll allow you to show the people that I still got joy. God says you may have to weep the next night, but I'll still allow you to turn around and show the people that I got joy. Why? Because faith is what keeps me going. God's mercy and grace is what keeps me moving. God's mercy and grace is what moves me in the direction when my ship is sailing and when my ship is about to crash. People ask all the time. We look at people and we just don't understand the story behind the story. And we don't understand how they made it through this and how they made it through that. But one thing is God is saying is that I need you to be strong, because your life is connected to somebody else's life. See, God never created us for ourselves, and God never called us for ourselves. What good is having a calling on your life if you only minister to yourself? You're not good for nobody but yourself. But God says when your life has a purpose that's connected to many people, sometimes mothers want to throw in a towel, but you got the babies looking at you to be the strong one. Sometimes fathers want to walk away and throw everything up in the air, but you got the babies and the sons looking at you for to be a mentor. You got the daughters looking at you for to be an example of what a man should be. How can we still keep ourselves happy when we going into a shipwreck? God says, I had an answer. God says, I got the answer. You got to keep your faith. Like Paul says, what y'all don't understand is the God that I serve. Now, remember, Paul used to persecute Christians for serving God. God will change your life around and they won't even realize who you used to be. You got to be careful that when God says, I need you because you connected to people's purposes and destiny, God will make you look like you never did what you did before. Y'all, I thank God. I thank God that on a daily basis, I got to encourage myself. On a daily basis, I have to talk to God. Yes, I do. On a daily basis, I got to pray to God, because like I said, you got people that's connected to you, and we all human. You know, a lot of people can say, yeah, easier said than done. It is easier said than done, but fool around and get on the ship, and you know that this ship is about to crash and ain't nothing you can do about it. Fool around and let life happen to you. That's why I never say, I understand why people say never say what you will do if you ain't been there before. How you know what you gonna do on the ship that's about to hit a wall? How you know? You ain't never got on the ship that was crashing. So, y'all, with that being said, I just thank each and every one of you all on here tonight for joining in. Tamika, thank you so much. Ross, thank you so much for joining in. Markeisha Stewart, thank you so much for joining in. Lucretia Boxdale, thank you so much for joining in with us tonight. Real, yeah, I seen you on here tonight. I seen my daughter Kiki. Zizi, thank you so much for joining in with us tonight. Paradise Paris, I seen you on here tonight. J. Lou, Jeffrey, I seen you on. Pierre, Latanya, Rainey, Taz, y'all. I seen all y'all on here tonight, and I appreciate y'all for getting on here tonight, because I'm gonna tell y'all just don't know. One of my friends, she asked me, she asked me a question. She says, you encourage people all the time and you pour out so much, and the question became, who pours back into you? You got to get real. That's why you get on here. You got to talk to God. You gotta talk to God, because sometimes giving out so much that you start to lose pieces of yourself. Let's keep it real. Giving out so much and you start to lose yourself. But what I told her is, I says I have to be in constant communication with God on a daily basis, asking God, listen, I get real with God. Now, I don't know how y'all do it, but I mean, you can get real with God. You can go right to the altar and tell God everything that's going on in your life. And one thing about it, God ain't about to pick up no phone and start calling this person and that person and telling them what you said. You got to get real with God. I ask God all the time, God, what's happening? God, what's going on? God, I need you. God, help me. Sometimes you got to be at the job working and praying. You got to ask God, God, you got to help me move through this situation. Help me navigate through this situation. You got to talk to God and you say, God, you said write the vision, make it plain, but it looks like I'm at a hole in the vision. God, what's happened? Where's the kink in the holes at? So y'all, I just encourage y'all on tonight. God is good. God is good, y'all. Like I said, I thank each and every one of you all for getting on here tonight. Y'all just don't know. Y'all getting on here tonight. Every time that y'all get on here just to hear the word of God, y'all really encourage me because it helps me to understand that we all facing something. Some of us may be facing the same situation. Some of us may be facing a different situation. But one thing I do realize is that we all going through something. And God says, how can two walk unless they agree? One thing we agree is that we need God like we never needed him before. One thing we can agree is that we need the word of God to move us through situations and circumstances. See, you got to realize when you got a circle, what are y'all agreeing on? See, anybody can get together and agree over foolishness, but can we agree that we need God to move us through some situations and circumstances? Can we agree that when one another crying at night, I can pray to God and say, God, I come touching and agreeing that my sister who has a broken heart or my brother who's hurting right now, God, I decree and declare that you'll move that thing. Can we all agree that God is still able to do some things? Can we all agree? And y'all, with that being said, Charlene, thank you so much on tonight. I just thank y'all. I just thank each and every one of y'all for joining in with us on this with me on this podcast tonight. My husband, he's behind the scenes working on the all this stuff, all this media stuff. I don't know how to do that, but he's behind the scenes. So y'all give him a hand for doing that for me. I appreciate it. You know, even Jeffrey said, woman of God, I found out it's okay to break, but not give up because I still push for breaking. Well, yeah, yep, that's right, Jeffrey. That's right. Even though, you know, it's good because when I come home from work, he has all this stuff set up for me to do this podcast. And I'm gonna tell you, one thing about my husband, he encourages me. He really does. When he see that I'm at a point where it's looking like I'm losing myself, he checks on me, he prays for me. And y'all, I'm gonna tell y'all, it's nothing like having somebody that can see you in your time of weakness that will pour back into you as well as you pouring back into them. And that's the reason why I believe that God has me on this mission on tonight, is to give his word, because none of this ain't Vanessa. It's all what God instructs and directs me to do. And I appreciate each and every one of you. Tamika, thank you so much, Tamika. I appreciate each and every one of you all for tagging people in. I appreciate each and every one of these young kids that's on here on tonight, because I understand that they have challenges and they have trials and tribulations that young adults have to face on a daily basis. And I'm gonna tell you, some of their trials and tribulations, honest to God, it's a little bit harder than the ones that we had when we was growing up. I mean, they're facing some pretty serious stuff, and my hat just goes off to them. And I understand that us as parents and us as people, that our destinies and our purposes are connected to some young person, just to say, baby, you gonna make it, everything gonna be all right, keep trusting God. You know, I talk to my kids all the time and I tell them that you got to trust God. And, you know, I just tell them about how I went through situations and circumstances. One thing I do understand is I understand what it's like to be a kid, because I once was a kid and I know how I felt when I was a kid. So I'm not quick to judge the situation, but I'm quick to encourage the situation. See, sometimes you don't realize, just sometimes they just need somebody to listen to them and then to just encourage them, to tell them everything is going to be all right. If we can't do that for them, but God tells us all the time, don't worry, it's going to be all right. God says, I'll wipe the tears. Matter of fact, he says, every tear you cry, I got it and I'm putting it up in a bottle. God says, I'm storing up blessings for you. He says, I haven't forgotten about you. So y'all, we just gotta just give back. And like I says, I thank each and every one of you all. And like Jeffrey said, you can't go around playing like you never hurt. That's impossible. That's impossible. That's impossible. You know why? Because Jesus even wept. He wept. He wept when Lazarus died. Jesus even asked God, he says, if it be your will, not my will, can you let this cup pass me? So we can't go around like we acting like we human. We human. But one thing I do know is that we still serve a God who's able to do anything but fail us. So y'all, with that being said, I appreciate each and every one of you all who get on here tonight. As I said, I think I called all y'all name out. I try not to forget y'all name. I forgot a pretty good memory. And I just do want to acknowledge each and every person. I thank each and every person who tags people in, because what I'm finding is, as my husband always say, Javon, thank you so much for joining in with us on tonight. As my husband always says, that we're a community, and what I notice is we look out for one another. We look out for the community, because I see a lot of y'all, Tamika, Latanya, Moniqua, Kiki. I see all y'all. If I forget somebody, I'm not doing it intentionally, but I see y'all jump in and y'all be tagging people like, hey, you need to get on here, like you need to get on here. That's what we got to do. We got to look out for one another. We got to look out for one another. So with that being said, thank you. Javon, it's no problem that you're late. Just go back. Don't worry about it. You can just go back and look at the podcast. Thank you so much for watching those reels that my husband do. Like I said, he does a lot with that media stuff. I don't do that media stuff. I just don't. I just don't do that media stuff. But thank him. Give him a shout out for doing those reels and those shorts, and he's posting it, and he's constantly posting it. I just know that greater things is to come, and I just want to encourage y'all that you're gonna be okay even in a shipwreck. Just want to let you know you're gonna be okay. Sometimes things that happen in life is out of our control. We couldn't stop it if we wanted to. Just like Paul said, the ship it's gonna crash. But I went and I consulted with my God that I serve, that he gonna send some help. God is saying help is on the way. So y'all, with that being said, let me go back up to the top. I don't think I missed nobody. I hope I didn't. I seen my sister on there earlier. She probably sleep right now. She be tired, y'all. Let's see. I think Gwen, my friend Gwen, was on there. Thank you, Gwen. J. Lou, Jeffrey, Rail Yay. I called y'all all out. Lucretia Boxdale. With that being said, until next Monday. Oh, you here? She still woke, y'all. I thought she had went to sleep on me. With that being said, I appreciate each and every one of you all who on here with me tonight. But until Monday, we will be back on Monday. Monday is me and my husband. Y'all enjoy and have a blessed day.
Support this podcast by sending a cash donation via Cash App at $VANLUC, and thank you for your support.